Hi everyone. So I think I've spoken about this project here before, but we've since done more field work and more work. So I'm going to be talking to you about the archaeology of Holyrood Park, which AOC's been running collaboratively between HES, the University of Edinburgh, and AOC. So I'll give you a brief run through of the archaeology in the park and also why we set up the project and what we've done so far. We've now been running for 5 years, so there's quite a lot to get through, so I might skim through some bits of it. So everyone will know Holyrood Park, I imagine, unless you're from way outside the city. It lies in the heart of Edinburgh and dominates the skyline of the city. A special place for animal and plant life, its geology, its cultural value, and also its archaeological sites and monuments. But from speaking to people visitors who come to the park, it's an underappreciated kind of element of the park. A lot of people don't realise the amount of archaeology that there is in Holyrood Park, and they don't recognise it when they're walking over the top of it. But it is visited by thousands of people every year. And it's very important for the people of Edinburgh. We regularly get 50 maybe visitors to our excavations every day when we do them sometimes. And when we run open days, we get hundreds of visitors because people are so interested in what we're doing. So the park's is home to the remains of kind of earlier landscapes stretching back over the last 2,000 years with everything from 20th century rifle ranges, 18th and 19th century quarries to rig and cultivation terraces, right back to walls of prehistoric forts and settlements. The earliest archaeology are find spots of lithics, and then there are the spectacular hoards of metalwork. This is top right, so the Duddingston hoard found from the loch. The earliest upstanding archaeology are the 4 forts within the park, which we'll come back to. And then alongside this, there's a series of cultivation terraces and enclosures, some which may be post-medieval, but some which may have prehistoric origins that we're interested in exploring. As I mentioned before, there's also quarries, rifle ranges, and training trenches, showing the site's been used right through to the modern day. So we set up the Holyrood Archaeology Project. Field School was set up in 2021. As there was a little information about the extent, condition, threats to the archaeological sites and monuments. So a very important part of the project is kind of assessing what impact all the visitors are having to the sites, and as well as this, we want to train lots of students, and I think we're now at about 120 students. So the first phase was mapping the archaeology and the pressure that the visitors are having on this, with a programme of survey, from very traditional plain table survey to laser scanning, photogrammetry, and geophysical survey. And planning this kind of building on kind of work that was done in the 1990s by the Commission. From that, our first area of focus was Dunsapie Fort, over on the east of the park. I'm going to run through this quite quickly because a couple of years ago I spoke to you about it before, so we can get on to other bits and pieces. But in summary, the fort is, you can see the survey plan in the middle. Up the top, there's an upper enclosure with a rampart going around. Our excavations have shown that that's a kind of 2-phase rampart with an earlier earthen rampart later rebuilt in stone, which is down the bottom right and the middle right. These are slots through the ramparts. throughout the top plateau, where we excavated slots through the rampart, we found lots of internal settlement and roundhouses, down bottom middle. Some of this, and you can see how poorly preserved these are. This is poking through onto the surface and surviving as a single course of stonework, and very much at risk from continued kind of visitors to the site, and it's very poorly preserved. There's an outer rampart on the west side and an annex over on the east with a later scooped settlement. And then up the top, we found more sort of ephemeral traces of possible occupation, where there appears to have been a kind of a structure, maybe from sort of artifacts within rubble, appears to have been built on top of the rocky outcrop that you can see on the left of the image in the top right. It seems to have collapsed into the trench, and that's now the only remains that we saw in our excavations. We got some dates from our excavations at Dunsapie, and it seems to be broadly kind of construction in the 3rd to 4th century BC, with a settlement in the interior in the 1st to 3rd centuries BC. Possibly this might be in an unenclosed phase. And then there's the rebuilding of the rampart seems to be in the 1st century BC AD. We then moved on down to the scoop settlement. This is built over the remains of the annex of the hill fort, with an entrance on the east side. So the annex appears to be overlain by the terrace settlement, with a roundhouse at the roundhouse in the central south of it. Outside the annex, there's areas of rig and cultivation terrace. We also have later agricultural activity in the forms of a kind of post-medieval bank that jumps up right through the hill fort. From this, we've moved on to Sampson's Ribs, which is a hill fort towards the kind of south of the park, overlooking Pollock House. It's situated on elongated hillock with very steep slopes to the south. And the north side is defended by a single rampart, and there's stretches of outer facing visible on all the way along this. Further to the west, northwest, there's an annex again, and then there's likely an entranceway both through the annex and into the hill fort itself on this kind of west-northwest side. There seem to be platforms for at least 2 roundhouses within the hill fort. And prior to our excavations, the only dating evidence is the chance recovery of this Roman intaglio ring, which possibly depicts Alexander the Great. And this is of sort of 1st century BC, but presumably lost after 80 AD. Found in the late 60s, apparently possibly in a structure within the fort. We'll come back to this because the dating of this and the carbon dates are a slight puzzle. So we excavated a single trench in that red square. Again, revealing kind of internal occupation in the form of a roundhouse, built tight into the rampart of the fort. So the stone, there's an upper stone rampart just at the right-hand edge of the square area of the trench, with a possible lower rampart further down, and we also clipped through the annex bank. So the trench is just at the corner of the end of of the rampart where it goes into the annex bank. Here's more of the So the carbon dates for this now prove a puzzle in terms of that Roman ring, as we appear to have construction of the rampart at some point in the mid-700s to 400 BC, and then as well as the construction of the roundhouse. There appears to be a later phase from material that was between the roundhouse and the rampart, but this is coming from sort of 400 to 200 BC. So there's presumably another phase after this that dates to the loss of the ring that we're just not seeing. That's something that we'll come on to at later points, hopefully. Going on, one of the most spectacular monuments in the park is a series of cultivation terraces that lie on the eastern slopes of Crow Hill, going up to the main summit of the fort. These have always attracted a lot of debate about their date and their origins. You can see from the LiDAR plot that the cultivation terraces, the ones that are running broadly kind of north-south. In the lower slopes, it changes to a kind of more kind of rig and furrow, going with the slope of the hill, also with hints of that kind of reverse S shape that would suggest kind of medieval occupation. So there's been a suggestion that these cultivation terraces are actually prehistoric in date, and this is one of the things that we wanted to try and investigate. As well as where we excavated, we thought we were maybe finding, from the LiDAR, we thought we were maybe seeing medieval or later settlement built on top of the cultivation remains. So we wanted to investigate the cultivation and the interactions between the two. So like I say, we dug in these two places. We saw broadly a similar kind of series of construction and kind of use in both the areas that we excavated in terms of the cultivation terraces. But these linear stone carbs or revetment walls demarcating areas of terracing following initial phases of stone clearance, and this formed kind of large cairns in our kind of higher trench. Within these carbs are cultivation soils containing bits of later prehistoric material such as stone tools and pottery. You can see the terraces going up. There appear to be about 30 of these on the slopes of Crow Hill. They each all extend for about 30 metres in length and about 2 or 3 metres wide. And as you're walking over, you can find boulders protruding through, suggesting that these have stone carbs demarcating the edges of the terraces. So overlying these cultivation terraces were the remains of a stone-walled roundhouse with an entrance to the southeast. Overlying over kind of one of the banks, one of the kind of carbs of the cultivation terraces and cultivation soils. So one of the most interesting things is that this is dating, we've missed it off. The dates for the construction of the roundhouse seem to suggest a 4th to 2nd century date. That's then built on the cultivation terraces. Alongside this, we also have this large shard of Iron Age pottery recovered from tight in against one of the stone carbs of the cultivation, suggesting that these are in place by at least the later prehistoric period. However, the dating of these is difficult because they continue to be used through later periods, so there's a lot of mixing of material. However, it's starting to look like they do have nice prehistoric. The final area to talk about is Salisbury Crags, which is the last of the forts that we've looked at. This fort comprises a single terraced line of walling with massive facing stones or revetment blocks visible along its length. At its north end, it's cut off by the Camstone Quarry that you can just see in the map up the top. This encloses some 9.5 hectares. It's a massive area that on the surface appears to be blank, and on the LiDAR appears to be very blank, apart from the remains of some of those 19th, 20th century rifle stances. There's no entrances are visible, and yeah, there's no obvious things in the interior. Running along all of the top of the rampart is a quite late bank that follows the same line. But whereas the rampart's been kind of cut off by the quarry, this bank takes a wee kind of detour and shoots around it, suggesting that it's later in date than the quarry. And then below this, we've got layers of colluvium slumping down the hill, floor overlying our rampart, comprising a substantial stone wall with massive outer-facing stones that seem to be set on their end, and also very uneven. It's not a very straight line, the outer-facing stone, with very kind of irregular. The inner face is much slighter. And again, there's not a huge amount surviving. Both the facing courses only survive as a single course of stonework. And the rubble core a little bit more, but not a huge amount. There's probably seeing large amounts of robbing from this to create various bits and pieces of Edinburgh. Interestingly, just inside the outer face was a length of charred timber or charcoal, which suggests that this might be a timber framed rampart, putting it into a kind of nice kind of European context. So, summary, we've looked at a bunch of sites, a lot of sites across the park, showing extensive Iron Age occupation. However, we still need to do further work to kind of understand quite how these are all playing off each other, which ones are occupied. Are these all occupied simultaneously, or are we seeing movement across the park from, and possibly kind of downsizing at Dunsapie from the hill fort to the sort of smaller settlement? Like I said before, one of the important things was training of the students, not volunteers. And we've seen over 100 students, and been talking to colleagues, and we're now starting to see them coming into professional archaeology as well, which is good. And assessing the vulnerabilities and impacts of the visitors on the park. So there's definitely areas of major concern where there's shallower soils. However, mixed in with that, there's areas of deeper stratigraphy where things seem to be well preserved. So maybe with Hess we can start to build some sort of management plan. So that's all our students over the years. Yeah, thank you.